Stardew Valley is a farming sim where you take over the remnants of your grandfather's farm after quitting your urban office job and try to live a more meaningful life, going back to your origins, to nature, and to a more simple pastoral lifestyle. The way this is presented makes it so that this lifestyle is shown as somehow an opposite to the corrupt, artificial, unnatural, and systemic order of the city life. But in fact, not only these are inescapable intrinsic parts of the system and persist in the new, more innocent and natural way of living, but they are also reinforced and perpetuated, denouncing the ubiquitous nature of the system it so desperately wants to run away from. The classic expression popularized by Mark Fisher is perfectly applied to the contradictions found in the game's narrative. It is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And so, in the fantasy of creating an escape from the so-called system, we end up falling right back on its lap. The romanticization of rural life is hardly anything new. In Stardew Valley, it suffers at least from the same cliches as in most other cases. This life is pictured as pure and sees itself removed from any of the real life's problems that come with it. Loneliness, distance to the centers of decision, reinforcement of local hierarchies as the reach of whatever is left of democracy decreases, just to name a few. But Stardew Valley goes beyond these. Right in the premise, we are faced with something suspicious. If it's so simple as running away from it all, that is, if you're only depending on your volition to escape, what is keeping us? Well, the protagonist is enabled to do this by means of inheriting their grandparents' farm, so the fantasy is already holding on to some pretty specific conditions that allow for it to materialize, either by means of inheritance or by means of an initial investment of some sort, which you need to be able to present. This is indeed a fantasy that you need to be able to afford. And so it kind of falls flat right at the beginning. However, let's assume that this isn't the case and that we can just choose to let go and embrace pastoral innocence if we just wish to do so. With which other social and economic dynamics are represented here? If this is really an alternative or a step forward, there needs to be some sort of tangible criteria by which we need to hold up this new lifestyle and compare it to the old one. For starters, several common problems that we find in the corrupt urban capital world remain. There is an underinvestment in public transportation, as all means of transportation are broken down at the beginning of the game. In public health, because you need to pay a fee at the doctors, suggesting there is not a public investment on it, and underinvestment in social security. There is a homeless person, and at least an artist, who lives in precarious conditions caused by a lack of income. In this sense, it seems like the new lifestyle doesn't provide us our basic needs any more than the old one. It is, however, true that these elements are used to serve the narrative, but we are in a certain way told to take them for granted as part of a more fulfilling way of living, which begets the question: how is it more fulfilling if we are still deprived from basic material conditions, the same way we already were? There are other elements that interfere more directly with the fantasy at times, feeding into it, but also being fed by it, which take a more active role in its contradictions. Such is the case of Pierre and the invading corporation Joja. Joja Corporation is the only thing close to a villain that the game presents us with. This position is very obvious, although with a slight nuance. You can choose to side with the corporation, a decision that brings you some material benefits and streamlines your progress. The moral opposites are self-evident. This duality suffers, however, from the same problems as the problem of the initial investment, as a way to achieve the conditions to be able to live the fantasy. First and foremost, there is quite simply the impossibility of any responsible consumerism, a very common trope when talking about alternatives. This tells us that you as the consumer have the power to direct your efforts and preferences to enterprises that are morally superior in the ways they relate to the environment and society. Better salaries and attention to ecological practices, etc. What is understated and is certainly made evident in a game is that Pierre needs to align with morally questionable practices if he wants to compete with Joja, who has the funds to outperform him on the long run, which is what they try to do. you get better deals if you side with Joja, so who can judge you if you do? Pierre decides to apply an organic label to his products to show that he is able to diverge from the more classically toxic capital practices. However, it follows that he needs to increase his prices to be able to stay on the market, much to the criticism of the townspeople. And so Pierre's predicament is made clear. Even in good nature, he still needs to abide by capital's rules if he wants to survive. As in so many other media, liberation from mundane, repetitive tasks whose outcome is for the benefit of someone else, which we need to perform to be able to afford food and shelter, is achieved in a contradictive way. In the end, we achieve liberation by going back to performing another kind of mundane, repetitive tasks to a certain extent for ourselves, maybe, but still to be able to afford food and shelter. Our material needs remain, and so does the time investment we need to achieve them. Our days are filled up with taking care of the farm, performing tasks for other residents, and trying to live by. There is hardly time for us to engage in creative activities or quite simply enjoy life. We are still deprived of those activities that make us human, and so one has to ask whether there is really any liberation here. Having this in mind, it might be reasonable to ask, whose interest is it that we achieve some kind of fake individual freedom this way? We pretty much just adhere to the following train of thought. If you're not happy with society, why do you take part in it? Cynically enjoying whatever level of comfort has been achieved. Despite capitalism's problem, a certain kind of progress has been attained in it. It is not a progress that was materialized by miracle or by the system in itself. It was achieved collectively with work. Renegating this has hardly any subversive value. In fact, it just works exactly in accordance to capitalism's alienation values. Someone will get to keep the fruit of collective effort, while we're asked to engage in a fantasy where we need to get our bearings and find a way of achieving some level of comfort. After all our work, we are asked to forget about it and start from zero. Not only is it not an alternative where we fail to find some sort of minimum life standards, but it also plays perfectly according to the rules it says it challenges. There is something very bourgeois about the luxury of putting your personal fulfillment in front of income. The majority cannot simply do that. Denying these survival instincts in which we base ourselves to support the lives we live is a way of putting the blame of our circumstances on us. Indeed, you should be happy with your job and money should be put in second place is exactly the kind of thing that someone who is comfortable with their level of income would tell you. Their actions certainly speak otherwise. Money is important because this is the system that has been imposed on us, and the real subversion should be reclaiming the fruits of said system so that we can all enjoy the comfort it has brought.